Okay. And it's Autumn Tolle?
It's Tolle.
Tolle.
Yep, Toelle-Jackson.
Toelle-Jackson. Okay. And how would I introduce you, Autumn?
I am a wife and a mom and a widow, and I have learned to live with my loss and embrace happiness.
Okay. Okay, we'll take it from there. Welcome back to this week's episode of Shapes of Grief. I'm very happy to be joined today by another American guest on the podcast, Autumn Toelle-Jackson. Autumn, you're very welcome.
I really appreciate this opportunity. It means so much to me.
It's great to have you, Autumn. Autumn is a wife, a mom, a widow, an author now. And Autumn has gone through multiple bereavements, multiple losses, really significant ones. And somehow you've managed to embroider your experience together into a book called Boldly into the Darkness.
Yeah, I really wanted to share kind of my experience with grief. And the title comes from my learning that when I try to run from my grief, I struggle a lot more. And when I turn around and I face it and I go into that darkness, that's all those emotions that we hate feeling. I come out of it feeling calmer and more at peace. And it's easier for me to embrace the good things in my life.
Did you have to learn that the hard way? Were you running away from your grief for a while?
I did, absolutely. I felt like I was in one of those horror movies where something's chasing you and you're always looking behind you at what might catch you. And I didn't feel like I was looking forward at all. And I remember I'd run for what seemed like weeks, and I'd just be so exhausted trying not to feel those feelings that eventually I'd get caught and I'd collapse into a ball and not be able to do anything for a few days or a week. And I did that over and over and over. And in talking with a transformative coach, she pointed out that, well, what happens after you stand back up? What happens after you get back out of bed? And I realized I always felt better. And so she asked a question that I'd never considered, which was, what would happen if rather than running from it, you just turned and faced it and let yourself feel those feelings right away? And what I ended up learning was that when I felt feelings coming, if I turned and I let them come, I didn't waste weeks of being exhausted trying to hide from them.
Yeah.
And there was a lot more peace in my life after that.
I think, Autumn, something that I really hear in the podcast and with clients is, grief is really painful, but avoiding grief causes such suffering. Like grief is quite a raw, pure emotion. And after, if it's the sadness part of it, there's the emotion of grief, which we associate with sadness and grieving. The grief process itself has anger, resentment, joy, confusion, all of that. So when we can face our sadness and our pain and let it rock through us, often afterwards there's less suffering, and the actual suffering can be caused by running from it, like you say, like a nightmare. It's a great analogy. And just to acknowledge, Autumn, your losses have occurred in the last 5 years. You've had a number of them, and you're a young woman, and this is still quite really big for you. It's still really close and nearby. And as you shared with me before we started recording, it's difficult for you to tell your story. You haven't done it that often in person. So I just want to say thank you for being willing to do this. So why are you doing this? Or for who are you doing this?
So with all of my losses, one of the things I decided for myself as part of my healing journey was I needed to have a purpose that was bigger than all of the losses. Something that Not something that made it okay, because nothing's ever going to make those losses okay, but something that can bring a positive out. And so I know when I was grieving with each loss, I tend to go to books. So I'd find whatever books I could read, and I liked reading about other people's stories. And I don't know if it's the truth in what they say, where misery loves company, or if it's really just knowing that other people have gone through this and survived and still managed to have a good life that touched me. And I started to think that, well, maybe my story can do that for other people also.
So this is incredible, because yesterday I met with another woman who's had a significant loss, several losses, Niamh Fitzpatrick, an Irish woman. The podcast just went out last night. But exactly as you're saying, she has written a book about her experience of grief. She said both for her own healing purpose and also just to help other people. It's lovely to hear you say that. It's like a need in us to make something worthwhile out of the pain.
Yeah, I really feel like that's true. And it does help me. And the more I share my story and I talk about it, it takes the edge off of the grief, because the grief, of course, is always with you.
Yeah. So where did it start, Autumn, 5 years ago? What was your life looking like?
So 5 years ago,
One second. Sorry, I'm just realizing I didn't turn off my notifications. I'm just going to.
So 5 years ago, in the beginning of February 2015, I was married. I'd been married for 6 years, very happily, to my husband, Joe. We had one son that was just about to turn 3. And at the end of January, I'd just given birth to our second son. And he was 2 weeks old, and I was lucky, and it was an easy birth, and I was recovering well, and he was thriving. And I felt like we had this perfect family. And I was blessed to be able to live that life. It was the life I'd looked forward to and the life I'd wanted. And for about 2 weeks after our son was born, everything was going perfectly, and my husband was really stepping up and helping take care of the kids while I was recovering. And he was working on getting in shape. He was playing basketball in the evenings, and then he would go for a jog. And whenever he'd leave, he'd kiss me goodbye. He'd kiss the kids goodbye, tell us he loved us. And on February 5th, he went and did his normal routine. He went and played basketball in the evenings. And I heard his truck come home about 9:45. It went pretty late. And I knew he wasn't going to come into the house because he didn't want to wake the baby up. And I knew he was going to go for a jog. And he went out for a jog. And at about 10:30, I started to feel like something was wrong. And at that point, I was back up with the baby, feeding it. And I tried to convince myself I had no reason to think that something was wrong. I knew he was starting to push himself and go farther, and it was okay. And at 10:45, he still wasn't back. And so I checked on our older son and made sure he was still sleeping. And I got the baby back to sleep. And I put on a jacket and I went out to the car, and I looked down our road to see if I could find him. And really what I was expecting was that he'd hurt his ankle or a knee or something jogging. And I went the way he had been going, and I didn't see him. And as it went on, I kept getting more nervous, and I went the other way that allowed him to run a little bit further. And I didn't see him until I was right next to him, and I saw him lying on the side of the road in front of one of our neighbors' house.
Mm.
And I stopped the car in the middle of the road. We live in a pretty rural area and there wasn't a lot of traffic. And I went to check him. And of course, the whole time I'm thinking, he's just playing some sort of ridiculous trick on me. But he was unresponsive. And I didn't, of course, have my cell phone because I wasn't expecting it to be a real emergency. And so I ran into our neighbor's house screaming, woke them up and told them to call 911, and went back out to Joe and started to do CPR. And eventually my neighbor came out and his wife came out, and she went back to my house because I have a newborn and a 3-year-old there by themselves. And she took care of them, and my neighbor and I worked on Joe until the ambulance come. And it felt like it took forever. And then when they got there, they took over working on him, and they worked on him. And I was off to the side and I was calling everybody who I thought would need to know. I was calling his brother, and I was calling his dad, and I was calling his mom. And
What's going through your mind, Autumn, or your body?
it can't be real. I don't know what's happening, but this can't be real. And I don't know why I felt the need to call everybody right then when they were still working on him, because I couldn't give them any information about what happened. I didn't know what had happened. I just knew he was on the side of the road, unresponsive. And they stopped working on him. And I knew right away that when they stop working on him and they don't rush off to a hospital, it's not a good sign. And so at that point, he was brought to the hospital and declared, and he was 30 years old. And at first, the police thought it was a hit and run, and they did a full inspection, and they took his body to the hospital and did a full scan for any injuries, and they didn't find any. And actually, even after the autopsy, they never really gave us any good information. They basically just said his heart stopped, and they don't know why. And so it ended up being documented as unknown natural causes. And so that was
for you, that's how it was documented. Would you have rather receive more specific information? Was that important?
early on, it was important. And at first, that night standing there, I was sure it was a hit and run, because a 30-year-old healthy man doesn't just drop dead. And so once I found out that it wasn't a hit and run, I felt I needed to know what had happened to try to understand it. And now I know better than that, because I don't think knowing would have made the grief any better. I wanted it to be a hit and run, if that sounds weird to say, but I wanted it to be something where I could blame somebody for it. Yeah. I wanted that to have that outlet for my anger and be like, you did this.
Yeah.
And I didn't get that.
You wanted a good reason why your beloved husband was dead, not unknown cause.
Yeah, I wanted something that made sense. And at the same time, once they ruled out a hit and run, my next thought went to, well, was he doing drugs and I just didn't know about it? Was I that clueless about who he really was? And so the whole time we were waiting for the autopsy to come back, I was so worried that there was going to be this dark secret that all of a sudden came out. Because again, in my mind, I was just reaching for some reason as to why it would happen.
Yeah, looking for some meaning.
Yeah. And I didn't get that at all.
So what was the aftermath of Joe's death like for you? How did you deal with that, Autumn?
So basically, the second I'd called everybody, people started coming over. So some people were local, some people had 2 hours to drive, some people had 7 hours to drive. And by the next morning, by 6 o'clock, I was pretty surrounded by both my family and Joe's family. And again, living in a rural community, a lot of the neighbors had heard, and we had breakfast was already being delivered to us, and a lot of those things that the community can help with. And I learned at that point that shock is a very real thing. I don't remember a whole lot of the aftermath, both immediately following it and for months afterward. I have these giant black areas where I just don't remember. I know I'd sit and I'd hold on to our baby and I'd rock a lot. But I also remember just being freezing. It was February, but it was pretty warm here. For us, pretty
In
warm.
Oregon.
Yeah, it was in Oregon, but it wasn't uncomfortably cold like it should have been in the winter. But we have a wood stove and I had it cranked up to the point that everybody else around me was sweating. I just remember that and I couldn't stop shivering. And I couldn't eat. And everybody thought I was just choosing not to eat because I was so sad, but it physically hurt when I would have food in my stomach. And you're surrounded by people, and yet with the one person you want isn't there, you feel very, very alone.
Yeah. So grief was very physical for you, Autumn.
It was. And it lasted quite a while. I'd mentioned I was postpartum, and between the birth and about 6 weeks after Joe had died, I'd lost about 75 pounds, which was quite a bit. And I had to make the decision to stop breastfeeding because I couldn't support both myself and the baby any longer. And then I also, as far as other physical responses, I lost a lot of my hair due to the stress response. Okay. And I didn't even know that was a thing.
Neve, who I spoke with yesterday, said the same thing happened to her. Clumps of her hair came out.
Yeah, and it was so strange. It was just handfuls. So yeah, grief for me, I have a very physical response to it as well as an emotional one.
Yeah. I'm struck by the 75-pound weight loss. That's an awful lot of weight. That's a lot of your body being shed. Yeah.
It was enough that there were a lot of people that were very worried about me. Yeah. Eventually we realized that I couldn't eat very well, but I could drink. And so they made me a lot of like fruit smoothies just to try to get some nutrients into me. So you had to keep getting up and showing up for your little baby and your little toddler. I did. I was blessed because even after the service and after a lot of our family left, my mom was able to take time off of her work and come and stay with me. And she stayed with me for almost 12 weeks. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I think she was very smart with what she did, because at first she picked up a lot of the slack and she'd made sure that I would read with the kids and I was still giving them some time and they were getting food, and she'd make sure the baby was staying on the schedule it needed to be on. And then the longer she was there, she'd slowly start giving me new jobs. She had been dropping the kids off at daycare or school because we wanted to keep them on a routine. And then eventually she made me just go with her. And then she made me just go by myself. And eventually she made me help with dinner. And then I needed to make dinner. And so she really gave me permission to be in that spot of grief while encouraging me to figure out how to live this life I now was responsible for. That wasn't part of the plan, that you'd be raising 2 little boys on your own? No. And I felt the weight of that responsibility, where I went from having somebody else to talk about all the parenting. What do we do for this? How should we respond to that? What do we want for them? And all of a sudden I felt like it was all on me. And it was really scary. Yeah. What surprised you the most about grief? I think I wasn't surprised for it to be so everywhere, I guess. It was in everything. It was sleeping. Well, I couldn't sleep on the same side of the bed I used to sleep on. I now started sleeping on Joe's side of the bed, and just going to the grocery store. There's so many of these things that kind of trigger those emotions in you that I didn't expect any of it. I thought grief was very sad and hard. And I think I almost expected it to be linear. Like, oh, it's going to be bad and then it's going to get better and it's only going to be in these situations. And since then, I've learned that that's not the case. It's very messy and it's everywhere, and you're going to carry it with you forever.
So where does your story go to next, Autumn?
So, for the first few months, I really struggled to find any sort of support. The area I live in has about 4,000 people in the town, and it had a hospice support group, but that was about all. And nobody in that group was under 60. Nobody had young kids to deal with. And I didn't feel like I was getting any support for grief. So I tried to find something, and I struggled. And eventually, a person who both Joe and I had worked with, because again, small town, so a lot of people work at the same places, sent me a message, and he had understood grief. He'd lost his father a few years earlier, and he understood that it's not pretty. And sometimes you just need somebody to talk to about all those thoughts without judgment. And so he reached out to me and became the person that I could go to, and I could make a dark joke and not feel like I was being judged, or I could talk about how upsetting something was. And he would talk to me about that. But more than that, he would talk to me about life and other things. I found that after my husband had died, it made me a little bit of a celebrity in a small town where I didn't want to be one. And I felt that everybody just focused on that loss. And I didn't feel like I was more than that loss. And so when Kyle and I started talking, he made me remember that I was more than the loss. I had a whole life, and I had an identity, and I was a person that was greater than a young widow. And so that grew into a really strong friendship. And eventually I woke up one morning and I realized that it could be more than a friendship. And I was so confused because at this point it was only 5 months or so after Joe had died. And I wasn't looking for a new relationship. But at the same time, I'd had such an amazing relationship with Joe that I didn't want to turn my back on something that could potentially be good in the future. And so Kyle and I started dating very quietly in the evenings after the kids were asleep, and just became really good friends. And while we were in that stage, I got a call from my aunt and uncle that my cousin, who was like a sister to me, we'd spent all our time growing up, all of our family trips together. And she was like the person I always wanted to be. If she liked certain music growing up, I liked that music. If she did something, I wanted to do it.
What's her name?
Her name was Brittany. And she had had troubles in the past with anxiety and depression, and her heart rate would sometimes skyrocket, and they couldn't quite figure out what it was. But the assumption was that it was tied to some of the mental health issues. And she ended up needing to be put into a medically induced coma because they needed to keep an oxygen mask on her. And she just would not keep it on while they tried to get her heart stabilized. And so they got her stabilized. And since they weren't sure what was going on, they transferred her to a bigger hospital. And at that point, Kyle and I went over to the western side of Oregon, which is about 4 or 5 hours away from where we live, to take care of their animals and I needed Kyle there, one, because he was my support person, but also because if I needed to go to the hospital, then he could watch the kids for me. And a lot of my family was at the hospital with her, and we got an update that things were looking good. Everything was stabilized. They have an idea of what might be going on with her. And I went to bed happy. And at 1:00 in the morning, I got a phone call. And what I'm learning is you don't get good phone calls in the middle of the night. And what they had found was that she was no longer responsive. Her body had started to recover, but her mind had stopped. And that she was currently on life support, but she was going to be taken off of it. And so I got up in the middle of the night and left Kyle and the kids and drove another 2 hours to the hospital where she was at, and had a few minutes to say my goodbyes. And right as the sun was coming up, they took her off of life support, and she passed away, and she was in her early 30s also. And what they found,
just 6 months after Joe died.
Yep, just a short 6 months after he died. And Joe and Brittany were probably 2 of the top 3 people in my life outside of my kids. And so I lost them both. And again, at that point, they didn't really know what had happened to her. And what they'd realized was it's called a pheochromocytoma, but it's a tumor on her adrenal gland that threw all of her hormones out of whack, basically. And when she went into the hospital, some of the medications they gave her to get her heart under control didn't react well with her current hormone levels. And it resulted in her being brain dead. And it was hard because the more we researched into it, we found that if she could have been diagnosed, it's a super easy, super treatable type of cancer. But she wasn't diagnosed until a few hours before she passed away.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you. It was, I don't know, there's no grief is better, but it felt like just the suddenness of both of them. It knocks the wind out of you a little bit, and not understanding why it's happening.
So shocking and so untimely.
Yeah. And they were both so young, and they were both so full of life, and they were just getting to the spots where they wanted to be in their lives. And all of a sudden, it just seemed like it was ripped away from them.
So how did you manage this new shock and this new loss on top of your already deep grief for the death of your husband? And just to clarify for anyone listening, although you had met Kyle and were developing this new relationship with Kyle, that does not erase the grief you had for Joe, right?
Yes.
Like this happiness and joy is coexisting with still the shock and grief for your husband's sudden death.
Yeah, I was very much grieving Joe while I was developing a relationship with Kyle. And there's something very strange about wanting to tell your late husband about your new boyfriend. But after Brittany had passed away, I think I really went from Joe, where I couldn't do anything, I just sat and stared blankly, to trying to do so much that I didn't have to pay attention to any of it. So I did whatever I could for my aunt. I took care of the house. I took care of putting together slideshows or talking to people or doing any little job I could find, so I didn't have to focus on it.
It was too much.
It was too much. And I just tried to not stop and think about it.
When did it catch up with you, Autumn?
It did. And of course, it caught up to me in ways that weren't healthy, and it caught up to me in ways where it affected the relationship that I was building with Kyle, because I didn't know that I'd get in these funks, and I didn't know they were being caused by my grief. And I wasn't willing to admit it, is probably what was more likely the case. But I'd found that I was really pushing that depression area where I would just be sad and tired and not happy and not smiling and not laughing for weeks at a time. And it wasn't good for me, and it wasn't good for my kids, and it wasn't good for Kyle. And I struggled with that for quite a while.
Why do you name that depression as opposed to grief?
I think when you're grieving, sometimes they're very tied together. I think at that point, I had named it depression because I felt like as I got further away from those losses, I should be done grieving. I felt that's what our culture kind of told us, was that you have your 4 days of bereavement leave at work, and you have 2 weeks to kind of be sad, and then you just need to get over it yourself and life goes on. And so I think I was trying to blame it on something other than grief. And at the now I know it wasn't. It was just grief that I wasn't dealing with. But at that point, I felt it was depression.
Because you didn't understand the nature of grief, and that it would be completely normal to still be in deep grief 6, 12, 18 months, 24 months after such a profound loss, and 2 of them.
Yeah, I didn't understand that. And also, I think once Kyle and I were dating openly, the number of people I had come up and be like, oh, well, I guess you're over Joe now. I think when you hear that so many times, you start either maybe not believing it, but you start thinking that's how it should be.
Yeah, that's what I need to do to conform to their expectations of me.
Exactly. And of course, now I know that most people that say things like that probably have never had really deep experiences with grief, and they just don't know better. It's not that they're trying to be mean or anything about it. They just don't understand.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah. So at what point did you realize this is grief and start to actually turn and face it again?
My sister really helped with that, and she was also struggling a lot, and she found a transformative coach that lived in her town, which is 2 hours away from mine. And she went and started seeing her, and she felt better. She acknowledged that a lot of the things that were going in her life were due to grief, and she thought I would benefit from it. And so, as much as I didn't want to go talk to somebody, because if I'm talking to somebody, then I obviously have a problem, which isn't true, but that's how I felt. But she really pushed me for it, and I told her I'd give it a shot. And so when I went and started talking to my coach, she really opened up my eyes to how some of the things that were going on in my life that I was trying to rationalize on something else were all part of this grief that I was just trying to ignore and trying not to deal with. And so once I started talking with her and going and seeing her, it really opened my eyes.
So what changed?
I stopped running from it. Like we were talking earlier, I started allowing myself to feel my grief. And over time, I started to let others also see my grief. I always liked being the tough girl. I liked being the one, I didn't cry over much. I didn't show a lot of those girly emotions that I wanted to be a tomboy. And so having other people see me cry was something that just, I hated the thought of it. I didn't like crying when I was alone. I really didn't like crying in front of other people. And when I started to just let myself feel those feelings and stop apologizing for it, things really changed for me. And so if I heard an ambulance and that would remind me of that night with Joe, I would have tears running down my face. And I wouldn't run out of the room or go and excuse myself. I'd just sit there and let him come. And I felt a little bit more like I had some control back in my life.
Hmm. So what happened next, Autumn?
So that we lost Brittany in September, and in February of that year, we went on a huge family reunion cruise with my mom's side of the family. And when we got back from that, my grandpa, who had been in remission from cancer, they found out he wasn't in remission any longer. And he had about 2 weeks left to live. And so we all gathered around him, and he passed away, surrounded by his family. And it just kind of added on to that compounding grief where people are just dropping left and right. It seemed like it had been barely over a year since Joe had died, and we've already lost 3 family members. But at that point, I was starting to work with the coach, and I felt I was able to manage my grief a little bit and acknowledge it better. And so about a year and a half after that, Kyle and I ended up getting married. And that was in June of 2017. And in July of 2018, we added a beautiful little girl, Riley Marie, to our family. And so we were now a family of 6 in a really interesting way, because Kyle made a point to make sure that Joe was still in our lives. He was in pictures on the walls, he was in our conversations. And the boys had their dad in heaven, and they had a dad on earth. And then we added Riley to it. And she was super easy. She was always in a good mood. She hardly ever cried. And when she did, it was for like 5 minutes. I think when she'd cry for 10 minutes, we'd start getting all frazzled. And then we'd have to remember that most babies cry for a lot longer than
When
that.
was she born?
When was she born? She was born on July 10th.
In what year?
Of 2018.
Okay.
So for the next about 3 months, we were just this family, and we were enjoying life, and we were enjoying each other. And in the end of October of that same year, we all got some colds. The kids, both of the boys got colds. Kyle and I both got colds. We had runny noses and sore throats, and nothing too serious, just a little cold. And Riley got it, and her nose started running a little bit, and she wasn't eating as much, but she was still having all the proper number of wet diapers, so we weren't too worried about her. And once those diapers started getting a little less regular, and I knew she just wasn't drinking that much, we went into the hospital because we were worried about her being dehydrated. And the doctor looked at her and said, yeah, she is a little bit dehydrated. We'll go get an IV. And we went over to the emergency room so they could get an IV in her. And the poor little girl, they could not get a vein. She had those amazing little chunky arms and legs, and it really tiny veins, and they just couldn't get something in. And so they ended. What was that?
How old was Riley?
She was about 3.5 months at that point. And so they changed tactics, and they wanted us to stay overnight just to monitor her. And they put in a nasogastric tube, and every 15 minutes for about 12 hours, one of us would give her a little bit of formula through the tube. And she stopped being dehydrated, but they noticed that she had a little bit of extra weakness in her head and her neck muscles, keeping in mind that she's only 3 months, so her head's a little wobbly anyways. And they were concerned about what was causing that. They felt once she had been dehydrated and gotten some good nutrients, that should have improved. And they wanted to test her for meningitis. And so they were going to do they were going to run that test, and they asked us to step out of the room so they could do it. And Kyle and I both went, and we told her we loved her and we'd see her soon. And she gave us a smile. And we went out to the waiting room, maybe 100 feet away. And about the second we sat down, we heard the hospital do a code blue, which means that a patient went into cardiac arrest. And then they gave Riley's room number. And not long after that, a nurse came and told us that Riley's heart had stopped and she had stopped breathing. And I just remember thinking, this can't be happening again. And so we were able to go to the hallway outside of her room. And it's a small town, it's a small hospital. And I think every single doctor and nurse that was in that hospital was gathered in her room or outside. And people were bringing us water and giving us hugs and praying with us because we knew a lot of the people that worked there. And after about 40 minutes, the doctor, Riley's doctor and my doctor, along with the person who had been planning on giving her the test, came out and said that she was still unresponsive. And they said that they would continue working on her until we told them to stop. And Kyle and I both knew that 40 minutes is a long time to be working on somebody, especially when you're in a hospital and you're working on them right away. And while we were trying to figure out how you tell them to stop trying to save your daughter's life, all of a sudden from the other room, we heard him say that they had a heartbeat. And so we were on this roller coaster from trying to figure out how to tell them to stop working on her to now there was a little bit of hope that maybe she would be okay. So they were able to get her stabilized, and they called in an intensive care unit team that specializes in infants. And Riley and I were life flighted on a medical transport to a much bigger town about 3 hours away. And that whole plane ride, I remember watching the nurses, and they were being very careful not to say things out loud. And I could tell that it was not going good. She was still, her heart was still beating. She was still breathing with the help of a ventilator. But they would check signs and they'd show each other the instruments instead of talking about it. And the whole time I had the feeling that they were trying to not let me know that it wasn't looking good. And once we got to the bigger hospital, she was immediately put into a room, and they again struggled to stabilize her. I think it took them almost 2 hours to actually get her stabilized to where I could go in the room and see her. And so at that point, Kyle and some of our other families driving over, we had to find somebody to watch the boys because we didn't want them dealing with that situation. They knew Riley was sick, but they didn't know the extent of what had happened. And they got her stabilized, and they took her and they did some CT scans. And again, they were surprised. They go, we would have expected a lot more brain swelling. And it actually doesn't look that bad. So there's a chance that she might wake up. And we were so thrilled to hear that, but she didn't look like herself. And I don't know how to describe it, but Kyle and I even had to step away from her a little bit because she was so swollen with all the fluids. And we felt so bad for having to step away, but we needed, because we wanted to be there with her, even though she wasn't awake. But it was so hard to see her looking so different. But they got her stabilized and the swelling went down, and we stayed with her, and we had an amazing doctor who was both very open with us and realistic with us. And it got to the point where they wanted to do an EEG and see if there was any brain activity. And they did that for 24 hours and some other monitoring tests that were associated with it. And they found that her heart was beginning to work better. Everything was improving. Her body was improving. And she had absolutely no brain function at all. And so at that point, they said they could declare her, or they could wait and do a test and then wait 24 hours and do another test. And we wanted to give her every benefit of the doubt. So we asked for that part. And there wasn't any change. And so Kyle and I actually asked if she would qualify for organ donation, because we knew that we were losing her, but we wanted to make sure that if there was anything we could do for somebody else to keep them from losing their kids, we wanted to do that. So in the end, we were able to donate her heart and her liver and her kidneys to 3 different people.
Wow, it's an extraordinary act of generosity.
We, at the time, we knew, like I said, we wanted to help other people if we could, but we didn't realize the benefit we would receive from doing that. It still hurt horribly, but the idea that somewhere out there, while we were losing our little girl, somebody else was getting more time with their kids or their family members. When we were in the hospital, one of the nurses told us that Riley means courageous. And so we had started calling her our courageous miracle, and she was a courageous miracle for 3 other people too. So we had to stay in the hospital for almost 3 more days while they went through the whole organ donation process. And on the morning of November 4th, she went down into surgery to give her gifts, and that was the last time we saw her. So that was almost 2 years ago.
How is it for you now, Autumn, to tell your story? Riley's story?
It's hard to tell. It still tears me up, and I get a catch in my voice for it, but she wasn't around for very long. And yet I feel like she left such a huge legacy that her story deserves to be told. And that's my responsibility to tell it.
You said that at the time you didn't realize it, but you would benefit greatly from donating her organs. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we'd never really considered anything about organ donation. In the United States, when you get your driver's license, you can have them mark down whether you want to be an organ donor or not. And both Kyle and I had said, yeah, we would like to be an organ donor, but you don't really think about it. And so when we were in the hospital, Kyle and I both actually thought about it about the same time. And we knew it was something we wanted to do to help other people. But every time we got as much of an update as you can get, of course, there's medical laws and privacy laws, so we don't know very many details. But every time our caseworker would say something about it, even from the very beginning where they said the transplants were successful, to they're still doing strong, they have some of the best kidney numbers they've ever seen. And it's been 2 years, and all 3 of the people she donated to are still thriving. It takes a little bit of the sharpness off of the knife of grief. it makes it a little bit easier to carry, because we know that while we lost her, we didn't completely lose her, and she's out there and still 2 years later is making, I don't even know how many people's lives better.
Do you know who those people are, Autumn?
We are allowed to write very basic letters that go through the donation organization. We've written a few letters to all of the recipients. We've only ever received a letter back from the kidney recipient, and we do not know her name, but we do have a letter that told us a little bit about her and her family. And so we hope one day that we might be able to meet some of the recipients. In a really strange way, it's almost like they're a part of our extended family. We've just never met them. And so we'll continue to write letters. And if they ever feel comfortable meeting with us, we would be honored to do that. But there's a lot of emotions with being an organ donor recipient that I've learned about since then. And sometimes people are still dealing with a lot of medical things, and sometimes they're just not comfortable meeting the recipient's family or the donor's family. So we want to make sure we respect that, but just getting those little basic updates every time we get one, even now, feels like a part of her is still here with us.
I'm so sorry that Riley died, Autumn, after
Thank you.
such tremendous loss following Joe's death. Brittany, your grandfather, and then your baby. It's an unthinkable amount of grief that you've been through, and you're still so young. How is your family now? How are you all doing?
I think we are doing the best we can, which I think is pretty good for the most part. We laugh a lot and we play a lot. I think we focus a lot more on each other and the things that are important, and a lot less on the things that we might be told are important. Like our jobs, we do our jobs, we don't mind doing our jobs, but if it's something that has to give, it's going to be our work, because our personal life and our family life is more important. Our two boys were 5 and 2, almost 6 and 3 when Riley died. And it's a very interesting process dealing with their grief, because they're both old enough that they remember at least parts of her. The youngest is a little bit, has fewer memories, but they'll still burst out crying randomly, and their grief changes, it seems like, as they grow. They feel different things, and there has been a lot of anger, and our older son especially really struggled, and we've had to work through a lot of his feelings, like wanting to die so he could go to heaven and see her. And he also, one of his grief side effects was a lack of confidence. So anytime we had to discipline him for something, he would take that, even a reminder as simple as, you need to go brush your teeth. And all of a sudden he would say, I don't deserve to have this family. I don't deserve to be here. You should just kill me. And that has been a huge struggle, because you never want to hear your kids say stuff like that.
Yeah.
But we've been working with a counselor with him and making sure that we don't tell him not to say those things, because it's important that he's able to express his grief in whatever way he's comfortable with. And so as much as we don't want to hear it, we encourage him to talk about those feelings and share our feelings with him. And I think that's really helped him deal with his grief. But I'm sure the next time he hits a major growth stage and his mental development changes, we'll probably have other grief issues to deal with, probably for the rest of his life. But when they come up, we deal with them, and we make sure we don't let those moments define us or our family, because we still have so much to be thankful for and so much to be grateful for.
Hmm. So Autumn, when did you write the book, and what made you decide that you would write this book?
So I wrote the book last spring and summer. So for the most part, I wrote it in 2019. And there was a woman in our town who put on an event for other women called Know Your Worth. And her focus was on having women who have gone through struggles speak about their struggles, speak about their good choices and their bad choices, and how they've overcome those. And so she asked me to speak about my grief in January of 2019, so a few months after Riley had passed away. And I was nervous, and I made like 20 note cards. And once I sat up there and actually started talking, I think I only actually made it through 3 or 4 note cards, and I went on for 2 hours and nobody seemed to mind. And I realized that I do actually have a story to tell, and people do actually want to hear it. A few of them came up afterwards and told me they thought I should write a book. And I kind of tossed it around for a few months, and then decided to look into it and decided to go ahead and see if I could do it.
What helped you choose gratitude over bitterness, Autumn?
I remember right after Joe had died, when I was trying to find some support, I joined a lot of Facebook groups because that was the only support forum I could really find at the time. And even in my foggy state, I remember reading a post that said something along the lines of, "My husband's been dead for 10 years. I cry every day. I never smile. My life isn't worth living." And I remember thinking, I don't want to be that person. I can't do 10 years of this. I need to find something else. And what I realized after that was I need to give my permission to feel those good feelings, to feel happiness and joy and laughter. Because I remember thinking I'd see something funny and I wouldn't laugh. And in my mind, I'd be like, I'd have this conversation with myself where I'd be like, that's funny, I should laugh. And the other part would be, how can you laugh when your husband's dead? And so I stopped listening to the one that told me I shouldn't laugh. And I started listening to the one that told me that was actually funny, or that is actually something to be happy about. And choosing that time and time and time again. And sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I chose the one that was all about sadness and grief.
So you made a conscious choice to orient towards, I don't know, I want to be really careful with my words, but you made a conscious choice to orient towards a real positive, joyful path where you could. No, that doesn't even sound right. Do you give me the words? You made a very conscious choice to orient towards.
I made a conscious choice to embrace the good things in my life when they came my way, instead of letting the bad things take over. I'm not sure if that makes more sense, but
yeah.
I realized that the bad things, even though I was pretty young, and I am pretty young, and all this has happened, the bad things. How old am I? I am, that's a hard question sometimes. I have to do the math. I'm 36. I will be 37 here in October. But Joe's death, we were together for about 11 years. His death was one night, one horrible, traumatic night, but it doesn't wipe out the rest of those 11 years. And Riley's loss and our experience with her in the hospital lasted less than a week, but we had her for 3.5 months. Longer if you include the time while we were pregnant. And so I made the conscious choice to focus on the good things that came my way and to remember that they are more than their loss or the way they died. And it's not always easy and it doesn't always happen. And sometimes I do focus on the loss, but I try to consciously follow that up with reminding myself about the good things that I was given.
And it's how you manage the tremendous loss. And I can imagine it's such a fine line between avoiding your grief and then the suffering that comes when you avoid it. So therefore you need to learn to face the grief, yet also not getting consumed by the grief and letting it define you, and trying to choose to orient towards the life that you want for yourself rather than the life that fate might have been mapping out for you, which would have been to be that woman 10 years down the line saying, my husband died, my best friend died, my grandpa died, and shortly after that, my little baby died, and I'm miserable, which could have been an option for you, and one that many probably would have taken because they wouldn't have seen any other option, perhaps.
Exactly. And I think I was blessed to read some of those books and see those other options and see that not everybody had to carry that grief in that way that was so demoralizing.
Yeah.
And so I've really tried to focus on carrying my grief in a way that's healthier. But that doesn't mean that I don't struggle with it. And that doesn't mean that sometimes I don't make those choices where I do feel a little bit like the world's out to get me.
Yeah.
But I think the trick for me is not staying in that spot of negativity. It's for making sure that I find some light in the darkness. I find some enjoyment, whether it's in one of my kids' laugh, or it's in a smile, or it's in a flower, or a sunset, or whatever else. There's a lot of reasons in the world that you should try to enjoy life. And it's about making that choice time and time again and trying to do this bounce beam that you were talking about, where it's kind of a fine line sometimes between facing your grief and also not letting it overwhelm you.
Yeah.
But just doing the best you can.
I think because, nowadays, certainly here in Europe, there's a lot of talk about the reality of grief and how difficult grief is, and the importance of being real with it and not spiritually bypassing it and facing into our grief. And that is so important and so true and so valid. And not everybody has to do that, actually, which is really important. Some people do a huge amount of grief, maybe with a prior loss in your case. Maybe if it had just been Riley that died, your grief would be different and actually a little less manageable. But perhaps because of all the other losses, that somehow you were built to be able to manage this differently. So not everybody does have to go into the pit or be fully consumed by grief. You can lose a child and be okay. And that does not mean that you don't miss them desperately and wish that it was different and want them to be with you. And you can be okay. You can choose not to let it define you. Some people can. So it's quite unusual. Something we don't talk about an awful lot on these podcasts. It's okay to not be okay is that famous expression we know. And it's okay to be okay as well, if that's what works for you. It is okay to be okay after your child has died.
I agree with that completely. I think it's one of the just kind of general things I've learned about grief is that everybody grieves differently. What works for me isn't going to work for everybody else, because my grief with my people is specific to me. And I've also found that my grief is specific to each relationship and where I am at each time I've lost somebody in my life. And I think it's important to learn. For me, it's been important to learn how I grieve. And there are some similarities between Joe and my cousin Brittany and Riley and my grandpa, but there's a lot of differences too. And understanding that no grief is the same, I think is really important, because by acknowledging that, you understand that however you grieve is also okay.
Yeah, great message to get out there, Autumn. So your book is available online, Boldly into the Darkness, and it's
Yep.
a memoir of your life with Joe and the boys. You talk in detail about the night he died, and also the other events that you've covered here today, and how all of that unfolded and how you made sense of it all. Very moving story, Autumn.
Thank you.
What would you say to someone listening today who's facing into some sort of loss?
I would say that it is going to be miserable and it's going to be hard, but that doesn't mean that has to be your life, and your life can still be amazing and wonderful and blessed despite the grief you might have to go through.
Thank you for that drop of hope that might make a big difference to somebody listening today.
I hope it can. That's the main reason I'm sharing my story, is because I want to help other people. And it helps me too. I'm going to be clear about that. The more I share, the more it helps me. But I really do want it to help other people.
Thank you so much for your time, Autumn.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to record with you.
And can I just wish you and Kyle and the boys and Joe and Riley in their places, wherever they are today, that you continue with your happiness and with your grief, and you find more joy, make more memories, new traditions together as a family. You've tremendous courage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.